Hello, everybody. I'm Jimmy Farmer, and this is my AP style presentation on sports. There actually is a sports section in the back of the AP style book, so I didn't just make this up to talk about sports, but they got a lot of grammar, some specific grammar rules that I'm going to talk about today. So, the first one is abbreviations. Abbreviations are common in sports, and so AP style has some specific rules when talking about it. So the first one is ACL. Same thing for MCL as well. You can use that abbreviation anytime. You don't need to spell it out first on any reference. You can use ACL or MCL instead of spelling out the whole injury. And then moving on, common abbreviations. So like MLB, NHL, NCAA, those you don't have to spell out first as well. You can use the common abbreviation on any reference, so you don't have to spell out Major League Baseball first. You can just simply put MLB. Same thing as well for touchdown. You can just put TD, offensive line, O dash line. Defensive line, same thing, D dash line, and MVP. Those words as well are all common abbreviations. You can just use the abbreviation. You don't have to spell out those on first time if you want to just use a common abbreviation. So then moving on here on my slide, college football playoff rankings just came out yesterday. When referring to the rankings is when you can use CFP. That's the only time you're supposed to use CFP. You're supposed to say college football playoff the rest of the time. So like yesterday, LSU when they wrote out the rankings in like the Sporting News or something today, they didn't have to put college football playoff rankings and then the rankings. They could just put CFP rankings and then one LSU, two Ohio State, so on and so forth. So then moving along here. Staying in football, football bowl subdivision and football championship subdivision, their abbreviations FBS and FCS can only be used on second reference and so on. So you have to spell those out first, and then you can use FBS and FCS from then on out. Same thing for CTE, which is tough because the actual injury is pretty long. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I think I pronounced that right. You're supposed to write that out first and then put CTE unless you're using it, or from references then on out, unless you're using it in a headline. Headlines are fine for CTE. Same thing for ALDS, NLDS, ALCS, and LCS when talking about the baseball playoffs. Those should be spelled out first unless they're in a headline, and then the abbreviation afterwards. So like in our policy memos when we were talking about the Cardinals pitcher in the NLDS, we should have written National League Division Series out first and then on subsequent references used NLDS for that one. And then wrapping up, this one I found interesting because I had never heard it before. So PEDs, you're actually not supposed to use the abbreviations except in like a headline. It should always be performance enhancing and drugs, or not a headline, in a direct quote. So it should, unless somebody specifically said in a quote PEDs, you should always put performance enhancing drugs, which I found to be interesting because I always hear it use PEDs. I've never really heard it use performance enhancing drugs. I always hear PEDs most of the time, so that rule I found interesting. Moving right along to numbers. So like our grammar presentation earlier in the semester where one group talked about numbers, those are the general rules that you should follow except in certain cases. So like first base should always be written out FIRST. 10th inning, you go with the 10 there in the numeral. But there are some different ones. So like New Year's Six and Group of Five, when talking about the New Year's Six bowl games or the Group of Five conferences, you always spell out 6 and 5 there. In golf, you always use the figures for handicaps, par listings, scores. So par 3, 3 under, you know, 9 iron. Those are always in numerals. Those are never spelled out. Same thing in football. You always use figures for stats, scores, all that kind of stuff. So Nathan Rourke completed a 5-yard pass that should always be written with the 5. Um, so on and so forth. The game was 7-3. Those should both be numerals. So pretty straightforward there. And then fractions in sports in general, you should always follow the specific fraction rules that are in the AP style book. So like Myles Garrett had 3.5 sacks, you'd dash 2. Shane Bieber threw 7 in a third inning, 7, and then the 1 dash 3 there. And then specifically, the one rule that they do specifically mention in sports is if a pitcher in baseball doesn't complete an inning, so say like Brad Hand came in the 9th inning and got the final 2 outs, you would write that, got the final 2 outs, instead of putting Brad Hand through, 2/3 of an inning. So unless he went a specific full inning and then more, in baseball, you're just supposed to put got 2 outs or got 1 out instead of a third or 2/3. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward on numbers. Moving on to capitalization. So when talking about All-Star and All-American, you only capitalize those terms if the person you're referring to has been named to the AP All-American list in football or basketball, or the All-Star team in whatever sport they play. So if you're saying Francisco Lindor is an All-Star shortstop, you would capitalize that because he's been on an All-Star team. If you're saying Chase Young is an All-American defensive end because he's been on an All-American team, listed to the All-American team, you would use the capital letters there. If you're just saying, he pitched like an All-Star tonight, you would use lowercase there, or she's having an All-Star season, you would use lowercase there instead of capital letters because the person hasn't been named to the team yet, or hasn't been put on that list yet. So pretty easy capitalization rule here. You always capitalize the team's official name, recognized name. So like the New England Patriots, because they recognize that their fans call them the Pats. You can capitalize Pats. Red Sox, of course, is in capital letters. And then bowl games, the name of the bowl and bowl afterwards are always capital. So Rose Bowl, Orange Bowl, Sugar Bowl, those, the Gasparilla Bowl, all the funny bowl names they have, those are always in capital letters as well. And then finally, you only capitalize series and finals when you're referring to the World Series or the NBA Finals. So if you just put the series, you're supposed to leave it lowercase. Same thing, the finals, you're supposed to put it in lowercase. But if you're referring to, except when you're using the trademark name that ESPN does, except in those cases, you're supposed to leave it lowercase. And then when you write World Series, then it's capitalized, or NBA Finals, then it's capitalized. So then moving on, apostrophes and hyphens. So for apostrophes, Achilles tendon doesn't get an apostrophe, but if you're talking about somebody's Achilles heel, so if you're saying his Achilles heel is this, her Achilles heel is this, then you put the apostrophe there. If you're just talking about the Achilles tendon, she injured her Achilles tendon, you don't need the apostrophe there. Another thing for apostrophes is not to overuse them, only use them as needed. And another thing is if it's descriptive, you don't need it. So like in my example here, and the example that the book gave, Patriots quarterback Tom Brady is descriptive, so you don't need the apostrophe with Patriots. But if you're saying Tom Brady, Patriots starting quarterback, you would need the apostrophe there with Patriots because it's showing possessive. So then we'll move into hyphens. A really interesting one that I found was cross country. It says in the book cross country gets a hyphen, even though pretty much international governing bodies and the United States don't put it with a hyphen, so there's an exception there. It is supposed to go with a hyphen. Moving on down, the hyphen, no hyphen anymore in first quarter. That's a new rule. to the 2019 style book. It's just first space quarter, no hyphen in between. Day to day only gets hyphenated when it's a compound modifier. So if you're saying Baker Mayfield is will be evaluated day to day, those get the hyphens there. But if you're saying Olivier Vernon is day to day with a right knee injury, that is not a compound modifier, and so it's left without hyphens. So then moving on, our last kind of topic here, gambling. Gambling is pretty popular now since it's being legalized in writing and sports and all that. So a couple of specific AP style rules on gambling. So integrity fee, which is a proposed law that's floating around different places, that's always in quote marks because that's always in quote marks according to AP style. Sports books, always one word. And also AP style says underdogs, favorites, all that. You should only use those terms when referring to sports book specific odds. So you're not just supposed to say like, this team's the underdog here, unless it's specifically based on sports book odds. Then finally, over under should always use with the dash in between. So when referring to a total of a game that can be bet on the over or the under, you should always have the dash in there, and over and under is interchangeable with total according to AP style. So there's my AP style presentation on sports. See you all in class in a couple weeks.